Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome here today. I think we can get started. Maybe I'm just ask Marti to join me and Bradley also maybe to start with. Come and join me here in the center. I don't want to be alone. I just thought I want to give a little bit of an update for which many of you it won't be of importance, but for the institution it's important. Marti, where are we for the graduation? How many masters have been finalized? Not through the council, but through the process.
Well, we've got about 16 or 17 process masters and about 14, 15 PhDs.
So about 14, 15 people of this community will be graduating in September. So, I think some of them I see here. So good luck to those who are busy finalizing, and thanks, Marti, for engaging with that. I want to say particularly welcome today to Marti, our invited speaker, guest that's going to share with us, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But also to one of our PhD colleagues from the PhD community, Bradley. Welcome you today. I was very excited in our preparatory meeting with Bradley because he was making me aware that Sappi is not just about what I think, which is the wood and the trees that you see, but that it's also about other things, but he can talk more to it about today. Now today is not really about Bradley telling us how a great researcher he has become as part of his PhD. And even if he wanted to, we're not interested in that. What we are interested in is to listen to with what he's struggling and what are the questions that is still in his mind, because somewhere in this community and with whomever we are linked, there may be people who can continue the journey with Bradley, although a lot of his research has been concluded in some way. But it's important for us that we should have a sensitivity to the fact that we will never be completed as a researcher, and that we've never concluded our research. And in Da Vinci, it's quite important for me to see more of that reflected in our work, for those of you who are still busy with your journey, to actually be clear on how incomplete your research has been. Rather for someone else to come and to pull it apart and say, well, you haven't looked at A, B, and C. The insight of the researcher is a beautiful piece in the PhD journey. So I also hope that not just Bradley, but the others of you busy, Shirley, will, in your conclusion, be aware of that. Be proud of the incompleteness of what we are busy with, because we're not creating a perfect world. Just for these, there are some new faces here today, just to say the idea of these discussions are really to engage your mind, and that you will allow yourself to become part of the discussion, so and when you wish to, and that we would like to be proud of the fact that we're not here to sell truths and hold truths to anybody, but that we're actually here to confirm that we really don't know what the real reality is, and that all that we do is just a perceived reality. And I think, I must admit, when we speak to each other again, there will be a new parliament, the 5th parliament of our newly found democracy. And although I am angered by certain statements and comments, I'm similarly excited about the open debate that has happened over the last 3 months in this society. And I hope that you will all join in that openness of what is truth to you, and that we will not necessarily seek what is truth for someone else, but that we will all seek our own truth, and the next generation that's not even there maybe, that they will respect each of us in how we've contributed to a better understanding of what we are, because all of this is interconnected in some other way. We can't sit here at Da Vinci and have an open roundtable discussion about how everything is socially or systemically connected, and then when we go out there we live a life and say, no, we're not connected. So I hope we can all make the linkages and the connections up. Bradley, back to you. Welcome here, and I'm going to start off with you. Bradley is part of the executive team at Sappi, and I'm looking forward to see how do you bring the technology innovation perspectives to us today, what has been your learnings, and help us to really understand, so what is the focus of your research, and what are the challenges that you received or experienced in that? Over to you.
Okay, gosh, you're probably going to disprove everything I'm about to say.
Not necessarily. I think very...
It's possible, but not necessary.
No.
Okay. What I hope to
I'm
achieve...
going to make notes though.
What I hope to achieve today is obviously what Benny said is to put out a whole bunch of questions around, this has been essentially a 7-year journey of research. It's also been a 7-year journey of trying to turn around a juggernaut of a company. And one thing that I certainly learned in terms of Sappi was just how big an organization it actually is. If you think it earns 85% of its profits outside of South Africa. And apart from that is when you do turn a juggernaut of an organization around, you do it in increments of minuscule degrees. You can't just walk in and think you're going to change the world, as it were, even if you can change their design thinking or their thinking by design. And my journey with them has really been to come in as an outsider and to be part of a new executive team that we're focused on turning the company around. The key thing at that point in time was that the share price in 2008 was 144 Rand, and today it languishes at about 36 Rand. So you can make up your own minds as to whether we've actually made a difference. Now, obviously the difference is not reflected just in the share price. It's in many, many aspects of the organization. And one of the things that you certainly learn very quickly, no matter how good you are, large manufacturing entities have distressed assets, very large distressed assets. And you cannot simply go and write down the assets and get rid of them. There are people associated with those assets. And what I mean is you have very large mills, which generally have anywhere upwards of 3,000 to 6,000 people being employed in those mills. Mills, like mines, are located in remote areas around the world. We have mills from the northern end of Lake Superior in Canada, all the way through to the northern reaches of Finland. And to go and enjoy a minus 68 degree visit is actually quite something. And these mills in these isolated places generally support large communities. So you'll have essentially 5,000 people working in a mill, and you'll have about 40 to 60,000 associated people in the town. So in the second largest city in Austria, for instance, we're the largest employer. We run the Austrian railways. We provide hydroelectricity for the second largest city, etc., etc. So we're a major influencer in terms of what happens in all the small businesses within the communities that we operate. So when you come into a big organization and you think you're going to make changes, if you shut a mill down, for instance, we shut our Blackburn mill down in the UK, the whole of Blackburn shut down. So there's a massive effect in terms of what we do. So when we started looking at the kind of impacts that we were making on the various communities, one of the things that I had to include in the work that I was certainly doing, because IT is a massive influencer in this, and we're the supposed design experts in all things related to design, we had to then design a new way of shutting down a mill. So it wasn't just a case of getting the unions together, negotiating with them. It was a case of, hang on 5 seconds, we need to do this, what we now call by design. So it was thinking through the problem by design. And the reason why I'm talking about it is that's effectively where I started. I started to think about, hang on, if we're going to think by design, we need to think about how we think, if that makes sense. And in terms of thinking how we think, I'm one of those greybeards that has had more than 30 years experience in IT, and we've really been driven by technology. We were driven people, we still are to a large degree. So as technology has changed, so we've changed. Now we're in a position where we can utilize technology to effect change. So it's turned around slightly. And the most important thing from my perspective was we need to then think even more about the kind of changes that we're looking at making within an organization. So the big question was, for me right at that stage, was what influence does IT have within an organization? And it's not just about the technology, because I'm obviously the CIO for the group, but the R part of CIO turned out not to just be about technology. It was about information, it was about intelligence, it was about investment, and right at the very end, it was about technology itself. So when I went in and started asking the question about thinking, I had to actually think about my role right up front in terms of what role do I actually play within the organization. And when you might have heard the term, and I should have actually started out of saying how many of you are in IT, but one of the biggest problems we've had over the years is CIOs have had an executive role, but not necessarily a board position. And I heard it earlier in terms of we're aliens at the boardroom table. So the moment you're invited to sit at the table and be part of the C-suite, as they call it, you're immediately an alien. You're the first alien. Everybody else has a reason to be there other than the CIO. And so one of the questions right up front that I thought I had the answer to was, gee whiz, I know exactly where I am at. That immediately fell away, because the moment I was at the boardroom table, they said, well, who are you? What are you actually all about? And I said, well, surely you use IT, etc. So we had to then, certainly myself, I had to then redefine what CIO actually was all about. So the big question for me is, what is the role that IT can play in an organization? The second question that then came out of that is, how significant is that role that it plays? And the third question was, what is the value that it adds to an organization? And then there were a bunch of ancillary questions which are still unanswered to some degree, is how do you measure the value of technology within any organization? And the more research that we went into, the more we realized you can't measure IT's value, actually. So I started out this journey with a lovely title that said we're going to create or develop an IT value-driven model, and I was told model doesn't work, it's a framework. But it actually is about frameworks. Can you frame this up for an organization in a way that it then is sustainably usable later on? Not just in IT, but in everything that you do. So that was the start of the journey. I don't know if...
Well, maybe I want to ask something if there's other questions also. So now you have to find the context. Multinational, international group, a lot of dimensions. What is the CIO and what does technology value add to that? So where did you, as a PhD, then decided methodologically? How did you ground yourself at that point?
Okay, the first thing was, how do we measure?
Mm-hmm.
You can't change something you can't latch onto. And what we found was, I don't know if people know the term enterprise architecture. IT, we use it a lot. We use an enterprise architecture to actually define the data within the context of what very simplistically is the IT engine room. And so what I tried to do was to say, okay, if I'm going to measure things, I need a tool to measure. And if I can define a tool, and then I can actually create a picture and visualize what we're looking at, we have a better opportunity to measure it. That didn't work. It took me 2 years to realize that doesn't work. I built an 8 million entity model and it didn't work. And it took us a long time.
But can I interrupt for a moment? Why do you think didn't it work? Help me. Corey? What are you saying? Why didn't it work?
I asked him slightly, he wouldn't tell me, so it was coming.
Okay. Ilse, why do you think it didn't work? Can I ask this? Were you taking a predominantly a quantitative or a qualitative methodological approach at that time?
Quantitative approach.
Yeah. How did we know that? Carl? Why did I sense that?
So I can't answer that question already, but I think I'm sort of in the same space with him, where we
All
sort
right.
of deal in a CIO environment, where
Good.
there's technology and people and implementation of projects. And it's very difficult even to measure people, never mind the value that you're adding to technology innovation.
But it's interesting that he had the inclination of taking a quantitative approach. So he obviously, Grace said in some way, I'm going to cut this to size, I'm going to make little boxes and I'm putting numbers around it, and then I'll have my answer.
Absolutely.
Okay. Do you know why you did that? Because I
Mom.
think that happens with a number of colleagues sitting here. Why did you do that unknowingly or knowingly?
If I look at my background is engineering and
So you can
mining
solve
engineering,
it through algorithms.
and I can solve anything using a mathematical algorithm. Okay. And I thought that here was a problem that we could actually solve
Through a number.
through a number. And if we could use a design tool that could really break it down to the finest detail, we could then recreate the problem, visualize it, start applying measurement techniques to it, and then boom, we'd come up with a number.
So I want to interrupt because I want, for the sake of the other colleagues, what I almost hear Marti is saying, he felt into that simple domain of reality where you wanted to categorize things, and to take charge of it. Not necessarily successful,
Or control it,
to
certainly.
control it. So let's categorize it and let's control it. And then I'm in charge.
And you know what's so lacquer, as they say?
Yeah.
You can go to the boardroom table and say, I've got
Give
the
the
answer.
numbers.
And the answer is, and generally we IT people are our own worst enemy.
Did some of you sense, he made a comment before when he started talking, what was his point of departure? Marti, I don't know if you heard that. Where did he start? He made a comment. He said, if you can't measure something, you can't manage it. Is that a fact?
Quite. He was very tempted to
Yeah.
go there.
But is that a fact?
But he was
But
worried.
Purposely avoided it.
But is that a fact, Bradley?
Well, that has been regarded as a truism for a long time.
The thing is, the question is not can you manage it if you can't measure it. The question is, do you want to manage it?
And why do you want to manage it? But I think that was an important piece that I picked up. I almost sensed before you told me about your methodology that from an ontological point of view, I already sensed you're going to go the quantitative way because you spoke the number thing and you said, I'm going to categorize and then I'm going to be in charge. All right. How did it feel, the fact that you could not continue that journey?
It in many ways, it meant that 3 years of work was gone, first of all. And we had a lot of stuff. I can actually pull out many design frameworks, the ones that work now. But what we realized is that we had to admit not necessarily defeat, but failure in the context of the way that we were doing things at that time. And it was very difficult. You know, you're the new CIO, you're 3 years down the track, you sit at the boardroom table and say, sorry, it hasn't worked so far. At that stage, the company decided to do a number of things. It decided to change direction. So at one of our strategic planning workshops, typical Bosberaad, they said if Sappi continues in a twilight industry, so it's a sunset industry, it's a highly commoditized product, the margins are less than 5% and decreasing, the input costs are rising all the time, the competition is massive, the oversupply is 3 times what the market can bear, how are we ever going to make money? We've got assets we can't close down, and we just burn money every single day. And at that stage, we then started to say, well, what is paper all about? So the company started to redefine itself, and we were invited back to the table to say, what from an IT point of view can you guys supply us in terms of thinking around disruption? And
So I again want to interrupt. So you were almost getting into a probing mode now. The
Yep.
company was saying, so things are not as we thought it is. Maybe there's other dimensions that we just can't see. But it almost sensed that you went into a probing space.
Yep. We started to probe them about where did they want to go,
Yeah.
why they wanted to go there. And by the way, when we say where do you want to go, it's outside of paper. And obviously there's many things they still do inside paper, as it were, but it was a lot of outside of paper. Where do you want to go? the other aspect about it is what type of organization do you want to be, ultimately? And they then, out of all of that, came the whole element, the need for change. And IT people, we thought we were brilliant because we are all about change. You know, on Moore's law in terms of how IT change is accelerated exponentially. We thought we knew everything about change. So the immediate thing we did was to go back to management and say, do you know what you need? You need change management. And we know change management. And it was our next step in failure. Because if you know large organizations and their resistance to change, it's huge. It's far greater than what you'll ever think. If you're going to change an organization that's made up of over 100 different cultures. And we then embarked on a program, a year-long program, of trying to facilitate the change that they were looking for. And I can give you samples because it's tactile. The important thing was, if change was going to happen, how would it feel? Okay, so I've got something in here. Okay, you can pass a couple of those around there. And the idea behind this is just feel the change. And tell me if you can feel the change.
Tony, can you feel the change?
What's the change?
Something, I don't know if it's changed.
No,
It's paper. Clearly it's paper. But what is it? Okay, we're starting to go somewhere.
Yeah.
Feels like plastic.
It's embossed.
Oh, sorry, I should have
No,
given
that's okay, no worry.
Okay. What it represents
well, let's
is...
ask them all. What does it
Okay.
feel?
Somebody will come up with the answer, I'm sure.
Ishmael?
A fingerprint.
Fingerprint, yeah.
Okay, it's an identity.
Uh-huh. Emeka, what do you feel?
Looks synthetic.
What does it say?
Synthetic.
Yeah.
Synthetic. It's paper.
It's different.
Yeah.
It's beautiful.
And it has a compelling message on the front page.
It's very beautiful.
Touch.
Pick me up.
So what basically happened was the organization said, if we're going to be in the paper business, we need to add more value to paper and make it compelling for people to want to use paper. Because how many of you at the end of an email see the little sign-off line that says, don't print this email, blah, blah, blah. It's the biggest fallacy under the sun. Because by not printing it, you're destroying the rainforests. Now, how can I say that? What happens in the paper industry is that we replace the rainforests with harvested forests, what we call harvested forests. Sappi plants roughly 60 million trees a year, and in terms of that, we harvest around about 13 million. So in order to sustain your carbon emission, in terms of sustain the harvesting of forests and make sure that all your Amazon and those natural forests is not harvested, you need to continue printing paper. You need consumption of paper. So what we then said, well, then we need to get into other things other than just normal A4 printing paper, because people read the sign. It's on most corporate websites. It's the worst thing that can happen to our industry. So we were hit by a curveball in terms of our industry. So not only does digitization destroy the use of paper, iPads, etc. And by the way, has anybody got any idea of what happened to our market when iPads were launched?
We're shrinking.
The market shrank. How much do you think it should shrink? There we go. 10%, 15%, 30, getting there.
Say 45%.
Not quite 45. It's about 38%. So in an industry where you're highly geared towards this particular market consumption, 38% dropped. The period of time it took to disappear? Any ideas? Less than a year.
Less than a year, yeah. You can tell the share price from one side.
You're watching our share price. So in less than a year, we saw 30% of our market disappear. So not only did we have to change, we had to change really, really fast. At the same time, the market smacked us. Our share price went down to 19 Rand from 144 Rand. And you can imagine the net reaction of our shareholders, of the board, etc. And the big thing for us from my side was how involved can we become in terms of assisting in this big change that needed to occur. And the view was, let's start looking at Sappi as more than just paper. Let's look at a tree as the fiber of a tree, but everything within the tree. So the cellulose of the tree, the fiber of the tree, the external branches, all of that was basically our feedstock in terms of moving ahead in a new business. And we decided to put all our eggs, as they say, you sell the farm, you put all your eggs in one basket, and that was to go into chemical cellulose. And chemical cellulose is effectively the juice of a tree mixed with the fibers of the tree. So what I've done is to bring, once again, more samples. By the way, I picked these up at the office, so I have no idea what's in it. This is like a lucky packet. But this is to give you a view of what it actually looks like. So this is the change. It went from, I'll just pass this around. So these are wood chips that are chipped down. So that was our raw material. So we literally, this is how we ran the workshop. We went back and we said, let's run a workshop. This is our raw material. Okay, so how are we going to utilize this raw material in a very new way that's going to actually win us everything that we've lacked in the past in terms of profitability, etc. So that's basic. You can pass it around and fiddle around it. That's just hardwood pulp. And in terms of the process, we then developed, you all know what paper looks like, so I'm not going to say have a look at a piece of paper, but we developed a new product, okay, and that's what it looks like. I'll pass it around that side, I don't know if you want, and that's a new product. And what that was is that's the fiber from the tree that's mashed down and it looks like blotting paper, okay. And what that then became from that process, we took it even further and we developed something that's fairly unique, and it's what we call fluff pulp. I'll pass it around. You can take a piece out and feel it. And the idea about this process that we went through is the reason for the cardboard, as it were, the blotting paper, is that is a normal paper making technique. So we utilized the entire paper making technique. And by the way, this is where IT played a huge role. We were able to document and visualize diagrammatically what this process looked like for the business. So we were able to throw away our IT tools and graphically reproduce the process. So we went into a huge processing mode. And what we developed was the paper. We then had to take the paper and dissolve that to produce the fluff pulp. Okay. And the idea to produce the fluff pulp was to get it to a level that we could use it for other uses. Now they take that is a better consistency than cotton, and they spin yarn. Viscose, 40% of the world's viscose is supplied by Sappi. Okay, so everything you're wearing today comes from Sappi.
Oh, rubbish.
You're writing on Sappi. Okay. And immediately that we went down that route, the market reacted hugely to us. And so, for instance, people like Victoria's Secret is totally made from Sappi's product. And so you go from the wood chip to I didn't want to bring in samples, but that was the shift. So what we had to do then is answer the question of how do we contribute. We can contribute by putting it into a graphical format, designing every business process that goes into it, and there's around about 200,000 business processes that needed to be redesigned. And the reason for doing that is when an organization is designed in such a way that it has physical assets located all over the place, generally what they do is sell paper from that mill to the local community. They don't go, because paper is very heavy, and to transport paper is a problem. Whereas fluff pulp, you can feel it, it's very light. So you can transport it all over the place. And an example of that is, that comes from our Cloquet mill in the northern part of Lake Superior. It goes to Vancouver. Vancouver, they come via the Panama Canal to Durban. They reprocess in Durban. It goes from Durban all the way to India. Okay, India is our biggest market. And in terms of that, it changed the entire nature of how we do our business. So what I had to do then was to say, okay, the role that we play is a value-adding one. I can't measure the value, but I can certainly apply our business minds in terms of business process thinking to this whole scenario. So that's how we changed. Literally, as the business was changing, we followed that change to facilitate it.
Any questions at this point before I ask a question? Any questions? Okay, so this is now your research journey in a way.
Yes.
Have you been able to already conclude that journey? Is that where you are?
Yes.
And how have you been able to link that to what is traditionally defined as a method or a design for research? So how can we learn from your journey of research in a different industry, maybe? You particularly looked at technology interface in manufacturing, in a specific entity. But if I'm in a different works industry, what am I going to do to learn and to follow from it?
Okay. What we did is I worked with a professor now at Aalto University in Sweden, and Yuri Vanonen, and he looked at what was the transformational requirement to turn the industry around, what was needed. And the first thing that he uncovered was fairly obvious, but it needed a structural change. So any organization that wanted to remain in the industry needed to change structurally. We're an old industry, it goes right back to the Gutenberg press. So in terms of that, we had to change structurally. And to facilitate that structural change, I then latched onto the output of his work in terms of the areas where he felt structural change needed to occur. One was product. We needed to change the product, the distribution of product that we looked at within an organization. In Sappi's instance, we go from forests, we maintain our own forests, we go through to, we have a big nursery operation, all the way through to literally viscose for the clothing and textile industry. And in terms of looking at the output from his side, one of the questions he asked was, what would then be technology's contribution? And so I was then able to latch on to that and say, okay, let me test that concept within the contribution that we've been making within Sappi. Now, the important thing was to say, well, what was the learning that we were getting out of this? And part of the journey was looking at the IT systems themselves and the systems changes that needed to occur within Sappi at the same time. So not only were we looking at business process redesign and revisualization of the company, but we had a company that structurally was bound by 3 or 4 distinct regions: South Africa, Europe, North America, and Asia. And each one of those areas had its own board of directors, still does. And IT, in a way, was the cement that was pulling all of this together. But the difficulty for IT was the fact that we couldn't necessarily force centralization. That was the logical conclusion. Because our systems were ubiquitous, it was everywhere. We had pulled everything together. We couldn't necessarily measure the value of it, but it was all working seamlessly. One of the things within the viscose industry was that viscose can't be sold from separate mills. So all of a sudden we have our first vertical business within the organization. And IT then had to build new systems to support that vertical business, being the viscose or the cellulose business. And in order to do that, we had to redesign everything from scratch. So we had a reason to exist. So we kicked into design mode, not going back to entity modeling level, but starting at a strategy level. So we turned it around. So instead of doing a bottom-up approach,
Reverse engineer.
we reversed engineered and we did a top-down approach. I then went to MIT and spent a lot of time with Professor Brynjolfsson. I don't know if people know of him. He's one of the design gurus, and I spent a lot of time with Professor Oosterwolde as well, in terms of they're the fathers of enterprise architecture in what we regard as a modern sense of design thinking. And you will hear all about design thinking shortly. But the important thing about them is to learn from them what works and what doesn't work. And they said you took a heck of a long time to get to realize that it is a top-down and a bottom-up approach. But what I found was that we then needed to look into the engine room and understand what the engine room did, look at the direction or the vision of the organization at the top here. And for Sappi it was let's go cellulose, and then try and connect the two to say, can the engine room deliver on what the organization wants to achieve from its vision? And the answer is you can't. We thought we could. We called it the link of integrity. And when I first discussed it with Roy, he was quite excited. He said, gee whiz, if you could do that, that would really solve a lot of problems. And we realized that the distance, as it were, from the engine room to this vision at the top here was too far. It's too vast a gap. So we then, through various design processes, came up with what we regarded as an interim business reference model in the middle. And for instance, Oosterwolde has designed a thing called a business canvas. It's how can I put my business onto a canvas? And at MIT, they do a lot of work around what they call commander's intent. Has anybody heard of commander's intent? The West Point Academy, the military academy, teaches what they regard as commander's intent. And very simply, when a commander's in a battle, he has a battle plan laid out. Okay, that's his landscape. And on his landscape, he has all the strengths and weaknesses of his own forces. And he says to his sub-commanders, we are going to take the hill. That's the intent, is take the hill. There is no ambiguity in any of those sub-commanders' minds of what it's going to take the hill. So what the idea being that within an organization, you want to be able to lay out the landscape based on the vision of where the organization wants to go. And then you need to translate that backwards, as it were, into what the underlying engine room can actually do. So IT, they call it capability modeling. You model the capability of what's in the engine room. But in the middle here, you put a reference model. And that's what we started to work on, is this reference model. So we changed our thinking completely, and we've now come up with a new reference model. Now, part of what my ego, I suppose, came out in the early days is to say, not only can we change the way companies think about design, but we can also develop a method for organizations to actually be innovative at the same time. So I call it a IT value-based, so it's coming from a value perspective, innovation framework. And the innovation side of it was what we discovered when we mapped out this reference model, and there are techniques to do it, to map it out. We suddenly found that within the core of the engine room was this thing called value. There has to be value at the core. If there's no value at the core, you're doing things without thinking about it, then there's something wrong. You've got to go back to figure out what's the value. And then there's a business engagement part of that. How do you engage with business from this IT engine room? And in that process, we discovered there are layers of innovation that need to occur within the organization with this gap, as it were. And people call it the G spot. It's called there's another one. I met a lady the other day. It's called the V spot. Okay, so we now refer to the virtualization gap. It's a virtual gap that you need to, but it's the way you think. It's the thinking that goes. And I developed a model called the value actualization model, because I realized that in order to take value at the engine room and to put it at the top here, you need to actualize how you're going to get there. So we built this new model, and that's basically all the diagrams that we've got there. And in terms of that, as I say, we found out there are layers of innovation that need to occur. An example is this technology as we see it today, in digitized technology, is disruptive, highly disruptive. You know, iPhones, for instance, or phones, smartphones, we found out that most people bring their own phones to work. It was part of the research that we had to do. We had to find out, how do our employees engage with technology? And to our horror, more than 60% of all of our employees bring their own technology to work. Whether it's iPhones, iPads, smartphones, whatever it might be, they bring their own technology to work. And me being the CIO, it was shock horror for me to realize that we weren't fulfilling our role because people felt compelled to bring their own technology because we couldn't keep up with it. So part of our innovation layer, lowest layer, is how are we engaging with disruptive technology? Because all technology today is disruptive in nature. And that was the one way that we needed to look at it. A good example would be that part of now here is my other little sample. So there is a story to all of this. Part of this was we had an opportunity to get involved in another business. But the business is very tactile, once again, very tactile. And what we do is we create, and I'll show you here, we create layers and forms for anything. Now, the only way you can do it is to just go through the cell, strip it out and send samples to people. But the kinds of things we do, and our big clients, this is Speedo, our Speedo client. That's what we do for them. And there's just, this is the Toyota inside leather coverings that we do for Toyota. So we found that we can produce paper, but we can also squeeze on top of paper substrate any other substrate. So this is where plastic comes in. So the other paper that you see, that the magazine, that's all clay. It's actually clay that goes on and gives it that rough feel. This was to put a synthetic substrate on top of paper as a fiber. And in terms of that, it's changed Sappi from where they go as a paper company to a viscose company to a texture company. So Sappi is now becoming a texture specialist. Has another, it's called Cowboy, so here's another one. I'll pass these around and just collect them later. This Napa one, you'll notice, you can go into any of the fashion stores and you'll see it everywhere, because we're the largest supplier now globally in terms of synthetics. And the most important thing is that when we started to look at this, we said, hang on 5 seconds, we need to make this more tactile in terms of the modeling. And this was part of the innovation that started to roll out of this process. And amazingly enough, as people started to think differently, we then developed this concept of thinking, not design thinking, but thinking by design, thinking on purpose, but through a visualization process.
Okay, this is a rich story, but what I almost want to ask, so from the research, Bradley, other than being a project, an excellent project, as a thesis, what are you there for? Are you already having a proposal, a recommendation that you make to other workplaces out there in how they can apply or align to this thinking?
Yes.
Good. Can you share a little bit of that?
Yeah. What has basically come out of all of this is this whole concept of looking at the way you think about a business. And I started out by saying we needed to think about the way we think. And the important element about that is, in our specific instance, is to get that thinking to happen. In order to get that thinking to happen, you need to be able to visualize everything that you're doing. So, and I might be preempting what you're going to talk about, but design thinking is that it takes you down a route to visualize a problem, or visualize an organization, or visualize a problem, a systemic type of problem, and come up with different answers. In the past we used to look at a problem and come up with a singular answer. This journey just says that a heck of a lot more questions than actually answers that we've come up with. But the important thing is that you need to go down a design route. And I'm talking about a framework because I can't be that arrogant to say I've got the design. I don't. I have the basics of a framework that can be applied to any entity.
Just from a management of technology point of view, did you develop new technologies, or did you just utilize existing processes to create all of this product, for example?
In a way, I worked with Bert Engelbrecht using MetaBuilder, and that's where we found the limitations of a tool like a MetaBuilder. And there's many tools out there. You can use standardized TOGAF type tools, and there's lots. And we found them too limiting, because the moment I tried to take the tool to this top-down approach, it failed at the top-down approach. It was too complex. And what we've really gone down a route now is to start looking at a far more simplified version of that. So we're looking at designing new tools that are way more simplified. A tool would be, for instance, the business canvas. Now business canvas, for instance, they've created what they call the design generation. So if you go into designgeneration.com, you'll see all the PhD guys working on focusing on how to evolve the business canvas and to apply the business canvas to niched industries. So for instance, in healthcare and financial services. So what I did was to test the theory out, as it were, was to then go and speak to the wealth management industry in South Africa about design thinking. And I then was given the opportunity to go to their conference and be the keynote speaker at their conference in terms of what would I do as an outsider in a wealth management sector. And very, very quickly I was able to adapt everything to that sector.
Good. Right. Interesting. Emeka.
Yes. If you are going to theorize here, okay, it is going to become a PhD work. You are going to give it a philosophical dimension.
Certainly.
And that will border on theory. And if it becomes theoretical, then it can be a generalistic thing. And somebody can use it somewhere else other than your business. That supports what they asked you earlier.
Yeah.
So
what we did to
get the theoretical basis, number one, because one thing you said earlier, which I have been trying to put into context, is you said that when iPod was launched, it brought your system down. I mean your business down to about 30%. So if there is, and you spoke earlier about change, okay? So I don't know how you are going to catch up in your theory now, whether that which drives change is internal or external. Okay, you are going to theorize around that. For this to actually become an academic work and that has a theoretical dimension that can be adapted by some other industry. So that is exactly I'm trying to get that point.
Right. That's a good question. So it's almost as if I hear Emeka says, help us, Bradley, how are you going to ground this so that we can generalize it or take it to another space?
Okay.
You've touched on it here and there, but give us a little bit more.
What I did was to have a look at all the work that's been done around forecasting change within industry. So what happens when people start forecasting in terms of looking at external change drivers in any industry? And certainly within the pulp and paper industry, I started to pick up, not just in pulp and paper, but manufacturing. Steel sector is one, automotive industry is another one. Those big industries that have long cycles in terms of returns. In order to be able to forecast what the net effect of whatever the change might be in external to your environment, you need to start early, and you need to make a bunch of bold decisions about what the change could ultimately do to you. So for example, and taking the Sappi context again, we knew tablets were around. We didn't use tablets per se as being disruptive to our industry when we did our strategic planning. Okay, so I then asked the question, well, what if we had taken just iPad and said that's a disruptive technology, it's external to the environment, and we had introduced that early enough in 2007, say, into our strategic thinking? Would that made any difference in terms of where we would have gone from a philosophical perspective? as a company? Would we have made the change to chemical cellulose earlier, etc.? And this professor at Ulster University, they've done a lot of work with Price Waterhouse in terms of trying to figure out how to do better foresight creation, as it were, and forecasting going forward. So we then looked into, could you accurately forecast that type of disruption to our industry? And I've done a lot of research into that.
So you're comfortable in terms of Emeka's question that you will academically ground it
Certainly.
well enough so that it can be generalized and applied in different contexts?
Yeah, I think it's almost a lesson learned.
Yeah.
What we did, though, from a project point of view, was to then say, could we then measure the success of a project that we did within this time frame in order to be able to meet the change that we were seeing immediately? And I then did interviews of a particular project. So we looked at the project. We then took $3 billion and we put it into the project. And then we looked at the result out of that project to see, exactly what it's done for the organization. And through the interview process, I interviewed everybody in the project to actually determine what were the success factors that took us to where we are now. And in fact, it came up with a really remarkable answer. And it was about the interrelationship between people that you say, well, that's obvious. But it was such a huge factor of success that you need to start out with. So taking the results of that, we then said, right, what the learning would be is when you are going to look at change, really large change. In other words, you need to be looking at this all the time because change is happening all the time. But when you look at change, you need to start out understanding what is the health of the organization right up front in terms of particular types of disruptive change. And if we had done that early enough, we would have been able to accelerate things a lot better as an organization.
Now we've got time limits, but Shirley, I want you to ask, do you know who's the researcher here?
Who the researcher is?
Yeah.
Well,
Because do you hear him referring constantly to we?
Yes.
So do you think he's got personality disorder or something?
No. There's a whole, I think there are multiple layers of research. Obviously, he's one of them.
Yeah.
He's guiding, but the people that he's interviewing, people that he's working with, the people in the technology environment, the people in the external markets, he's drawing on those.
But I wonder how easy is it then for him to capture this as a PhD engagement? What do you sense? Because this is a complex system. It's big.
It's complex, it's big, but I think it's doable, it's manageable. I sort of see it from my perspective again, that technology is traditionally seen as making sure everyone's got a laptop or a desktop that works. Well, that's how people think of technology in an organization. Oh, those IT guys, again, it's their fault, our system's down. But technology is so much bigger, and it's all of those things, who your audiences are, who your markets are.
All right, so you're comfortable.
So I would feel comfortable looking at all of them, but keeping the focus on what is this thing that I want all of this information to feed.
Let's get another perspective from another PhD colleague. Can you see who's the researcher here?
Yes, I can sense who the researcher is.
Okay.
But I feel he's spread wide. There is a lot that the researcher is doing.
Good.
So
So what would you like to ask him to make sure that he's focused?
his main focal point for your research, from what I've picked up, this has gone on for a long period of time. And a lot of money has been spent in that particular situation. We're actually very lucky that you're still there. But
It doesn't mean that you're alive.
no. But I think it's because you realize that whatever you're doing, there is what I would call a sense of variability in whatever you do. With technology, the moment you get to this point, it changes. And you have to keep up with that. So my question would be, are you going to find it easy to say, I'm going to stop here? because it doesn't seem like it's going to stop.
Yeah.
The moment we start wearing this, the markets will go down again because something else will have come up. But I think you have to give yourself, I think, a point where you say, maybe I need to stop here. And then maybe give yourself maybe a limit.
I think that's a very valuable comment, Bradley. When is the thesis concluded?
Now,
Because she said it.
Marti? I want to add to Sophie's.
Yeah.
You gave a presentation 3 years ago at the executive PhD meeting, and you also had all your samples, different samples. Had you had to publish them, what would have been the difference?
But at that stage, I didn't have the framework, because the piece that was missing was what was going to make this replicable, and not just replicable within a Sappi organization, but external to Sappi. What was it that I could take away, other than samples, that would really be meaningful to any other organization? And what we've got to now is an actual framework in order to work with for other organizations. And as I say, the most important thing for me was it takes a long time to develop the framework, one that works, and the moment it works, it doesn't work anymore because it changes. Okay, so we had to say the limit is, at the moment it works, that's where we draw the line. Yeah, because you can't go out there with a model that doesn't work.
Just some questions that you need to ask for somebody or people, some things that are unclear in your mind that you still need some support on in finalizing this thesis.
Well, the biggest thing for me is to know people that work with frameworks, and really understand in terms of the types of design thinking that we've gone through, that they, it's very cutting edge. And in terms of finding organizations, finding people that think like that, I need the models now, the framework itself, to be rigorously interrogated.
So you would almost invite people to say, journey with me in critiquing my frame.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Are there any interested people in that? Because I hope you, Carl, you guys can talk to him.
I'm just interested to know, if you say you had to make changes to all your systems, how many applications did that affect? Because that would, I think, impact how useful or how much you can use that framework, depending on how big your organization is in terms of applications.
Certainly. Well, there were two things. One is we had to make it generic. So the framework, you're actually going to start off with the systems within a Sappi environment. So take, for instance, our ERP systems. The net effect of the new framework was to actually say, well, guys, we can't operate with 26 different ERP systems. So we had to consolidate to one. So in order to test whether my theory was right, they actually gave me $3 billion to consolidate, and we did. We consolidated. Normally, when you consolidate an ERP system, it takes you around about 5 to 7 years. We did it in 7 months. And so, in fact, SAP, I've stopped them from writing it up because I want to finish my write-up first. But the framework worked for that.
But your need is ultimately, if there can be people who journey with you, enormous critique, and I think, Emeka, you can also make an interesting comment.
And to pull me back onto focusing on
so you can
what's going to be
study.
meaningful. Yeah.
Last question.
So in terms of the board, if they had to articulate now the significance of having the CIO there, how would they articulate this? And where I'm coming from is I'm a marketer, and often the CMO role is also not appreciated the way it should be at board level. So how would the board now articulate the significance of having the CIO?
Can I just rephrase what I almost hear you saying? There are other voices who are not represented at the board. You have made an inroad, hopefully, for one of these voices. But what can that voice get from this?
All right. I'm speaking at the Safila conference, so you'll hear the answer. No, there are more than two, but two key roles within any C-suite function that are misaligned are CMO and CIO. And often the two work together. You know, I work with my marketing people hand in glove from a technology point of view. And the important thing about that is, in terms of being more accepted, yes, I am, absolutely. But it's only because things have been successful. If things hadn't been successful, I would never be there. As you said earlier, I wouldn't have survived within the organization. So it's a dangerous game you play, in a sense, if you're going to try and implement something that you know is highly theoretical on the one side, because I was told many times, stop speaking theory and come and do it. And the other side is it's dangerous because it's never been done before. But then if you're going to do that, and you're going to have something that's very visible to the organization, you need to be very careful about how you measure success, maybe.
But you will capture that as part of your thesis outcome.
Yes,
to answer that question.
Yeah, what we did was we sent out a survey to all of our employees, and it was an audience of about 10,000 employees, and roughly 3,000 replied. And really it was trying to learn from the end user what the net effect on the end user was. So we did all this work, we reframed things, we implemented a new SAP system, so we applied the technology to the system. It was the fastest SAP has ever done it globally. And in terms of that, so what? And that's what we were looking for, the so what, was to try and find that out. And the biggest thing that we found out was that when you do such large projects that affect an enormous organization and it's successful, it pulls the whole organization together. Because everybody that's been collaborating, and there were roughly on this project 1,300 odd people on the project in 104 countries. So it was trying to keep them all together in the project.
Great. We can continue the discussion. Is there any other pressing question you want to ask?
No, the big thing for me is if somebody suddenly found out a way to measure the value of IT. I need to know before I publish the value of IT. How to measure the value of IT.
Maybe it's not the right question.
I think you need to stop somewhere, then you can check the difference between the share price when you started it.
Okay. Yeah. I want to make a personal comment. I almost want to challenge you and say, will it be possible for this PhD to produce a tangible artifact to demonstrate the texturedness of your research? I just want you to think around.
Interesting. Yeah.
While I'm sharing it, there's a PhD colleague who's just busy finishing at this point in time, and the artifact that she produced to the institution is a quilt. And the study has got nothing to do with quilting. Just for your interest.
I thought of taking the framework and doing something fancy with the framework.
We will leave it to you and you will be innovative around it. Bradley, thank you very much. I hope that people will come up to you and support you in your journey and really help you in critiquing that framework as a review of what you're busy doing. Thank you very much. Is there any pressing question to Bradley? You'll hold it for later? Thanks a lot.